This evening, what we wanted to do is to have a discussion and kind of a historic overview of new atheism versus what old atheism traditionally said. And so what we're really trying to do is determine, is new atheism really new? So as you'll see in some of the upcoming slides, in about 2004, Sam Harris wrote a book called The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future Reason. And according to Victor Stenger, that kind of caused the movement of new atheism. It's really a very aggressive anti-religious atheism. It has four horsemen. They call it four horsemen. Their names are Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. And if you look at the next slide, the thing that I think is interesting is not all atheists are obviously new atheists. Not all modern atheists are new atheists. So there's a lot of people like Paul Kurtz, Kai Nielsen, Greg Epstein, definitely people like Alex Rosenberg that are not new atheists. But those who seem like-minded are Harris, Hitchens, Denkins, Dawkins, plus Victor Stenger. For those of you from New Jersey, Victor, if I remember correctly, was born in Bayonne. He went to New Jersey Institute of Technology. He got his PhD, I believe, at UCLA and was a physics professor. Became a very, very outspoken advocate of new atheism. David Silverman, also a New Jersey guy, who was the head of American Atheists, which was headquartered, I believe, over by Rahway somewhere. And then P.Z. Myers, who is also a professor who seems to be very like-minded with the new atheists. But it's important to note that not all modern atheists are new atheists, and not all modern atheists are fans of this new atheist movement. So I guess the first question that we would have in comparing new atheism versus old atheism is, what were the key tenets of old atheism? And that's what we want to go to next. So if you take a look at just a sampling of people, okay, I didn't take this massive group of people and cherry pick their comments. What I tried to do is pick 6 atheists from kind of the mid 1800s to the early 1900s that are fairly representative of what old atheism was all about. Ernst Haeckel was a zoologist. Most of his comments are from his book, Riddle of the Universe. Ludwig Buchner was a medical doctor and a scientist. William Clifford was a mathematics professor. Gustav Spiller was a leader in kind of the social ethics movement. Annie Besant was actually an atheist for 12 years, and then she became a theosophist and got into Hinduism. But her comments are really, really interesting because they're indicative of kind of the general mood during that period of time. And then in the United States, Robert Ingersoll. Robert Ingersoll characterized himself actually as an agnostic, but when you read his comments, he was highly, highly anti-God, highly, highly anti-religion. And his comments are very reflective of the broad base of ideas that were being discussed in the atheist movement at the time. So what were the big ideas? The first is, God is not required for an explanation of existence. Second was science, not religion. Science is the modern way of knowing. Because after all, religion is flawed and outdated. And we don't really need God for morality after all now, do we? Because, you know, when you think about it, believing things without evidence is sort of wrong. And after all, there's a lot of pain and suffering in the world, and surely a good God wouldn't allow that. So pain and suffering disprove God. And then, you know, all of the, you know, Thomas Aquinas stuff, you know, it really wasn't all that compelling. So we don't think the historic proofs for God are really all that powerful. So these are the big ideas. So what I'd like to do is just take each of these big ideas and compare what old atheism said, what new atheism says, and see if there's really any difference. So let's start with the first idea on the next slide. God isn't needed as an explanation. So it's like kaboom, big discoveries between 1842 and 1877. Robert Meyer, Helmholtz, Clausius, and Boltzmann all came up with a couple of twin ideas that basically constitute the idea of conservation of matter and energy. They also kind of had the idea, especially Clausius and Boltzmann, the idea of the second law of thermodynamics and entropy. But what was significant here is the idea is matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. Simultaneously, Darwin and kind of his big advocate, Thomas Huxley, were parroting the whole idea of natural selection. So these are two really, really powerful ideas in the 1800s, especially when you link them with what they thought that they already knew. And what they thought they already knew is that atoms were indivisible, these very, very tiny things, okay, that you can't get any smaller. Electrons weren't discovered until the very end of the century. And then protoplasm is this basic substance of life. So here you have atoms, these very small things, protoplasm, which is this basic thing. And then you have the conservation of matter and energy. So what they basically concluded was, wow, matter and energy are eternal. So if matter and energy are eternal, the universe had no beginning. And if the universe had no beginning, it must be infinite, because a finite universe doesn't make sense if the universe had no beginning. And they looked at the laws of physics and they said, well, really, everything is just matter and energy. Therefore, physics really rules everything. So physical determinism is really the key force that drives our actions, that drives the universe. And because of all this, gee, the non-physical really doesn't make sense after all. So they concluded that God doesn't exist. Then when you pair that with the idea of, things coming from very simple things, you had Ludwig Buchner coming up with the logical conclusion, not based upon science at all, but just a reasoned conclusion. He concluded that, well, if people are composed of matter and people have energy, therefore people are really just matter and energy. So life developed from matter and energy. So life just somehow sprung into existence without any assistance. And surely nature produces its own complexity, because you have this simple thing, protoplasm, and then you have complex things. So simple things must produce complex things. So these are the two big ideas of atheism back in the late 1800s, materialism and reductionism. So let's look at what we've learned since then on the next slide. And we've learned a few things. So the modern view of physics, according to the standard model of particle physics, is there actually was a beginning. And according to the standard model of particle physics, the universe is actually not simple. It's actually pretty complex. We have 4 fundamental forces. We have 26 constants. We have, at minimum, 16 fundamental particles. We have boundaries. We have laws. We have, an incredibly complex construction of the universe. It's not simple. And the universe actually isn't infinite, it's finite. And indeterminism is a part of nature. Everything is not determined by the laws of physics explicitly. And a key thing is information is required for life. So, we kind of figured out that DNA has 3.1 billion characters of information, structured information, purposeful information. And the universe actually displays intellect and purpose. A lot of physicists are calling it mind. And you hear people like Roger Penrose and Paul Davies saying this. And the university is the universe is basically immensely improbable. Okay, so these are the things we learned. But what is New Atheism still holding to? New Atheism still is holding to materialism and reductionism. So in spite of these things, the New Atheists are saying that basically the universe is its own source, and that you know, there was no beginning, or and then in terms of the reductionism, they're basically still saying that everything developed from matter and energy, and that nature alone produces its own complexity. So this is kind of interesting stuff. So how do they rationalize this? Let's go to the next slide. Well, they kind of rationalize everything in spite of all these discoveries with the idea of a multiverse and luck. So if there was a big bang, there was a beginning, but they want a beginning without a beginning. They want a finite universe, but since our universe doesn't make sense based upon sheer luck, there must be an infinite number of finite universes. And so therefore, wow, we're really lucky. Then when it comes to particle physics, they say, well, there's no design or construction. And so, wow, things being the way they are, we're really lucky. And then when it comes to quantum physics, they're saying, wow, indeterminism is a part of the universe. And then in terms of DNA, you know, we don't know how this information came about. We know that life depends upon information. We know that the simplest life forms basically require about 1,300 pieces of genetic information. We don't know how it happened. We assume nature did it. Boy, aren't we lucky? And then they look at the rest of the universe, and they look at the whole notion of mind, and they say, well, it only looks like design and purpose. So I think Richard Dawkins is a good example of the thinking. He basically says that it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck. He says natural selection also needed some luck to get started, and that consciousness needed the same order of improbability, i.e. luck. So I think it's really interesting that, you know, here you have this incredible amount of scientific discovery, but the new atheists are still holding to the two fundamental ideas of the old atheism of 120 to 150 years ago, and that is materialism and reductionism. And the only way that they can justify it is by coming up with the idea that surely there must be an almost infinite number of universes, and gee, aren't we lucky? You know, theists on the next page kind of look at all this and go, you know, Mr. Dawkins, your line of thinking really isn't all that compelling. You know, there appears to have been a beginning. The universe does display mind. We see it in physics, biology, and consciousness. And there's no non-intelligent cause that we're aware of that is capable of this, and any idea of a non-intelligent cause basically exceeds the probability and time available. So you know what? We still think that an intelligent non-physical cause is the best answer. And so a couple of examples are Owen Gingerich, who's an astronomy professor at Harvard, retired not too long ago. He says, to me, belief in a final cause, a creator God, gives a coherent understanding of why the universe seems so congenially designed for the existence of intelligent, self-existent life. And then you have Paul Davies, who I think is a deist. He's not a theist, who says, who's also, he's a physics professor at Arizona State, who says, atheists claim that the laws exist reasonlessly and that the universe is ultimately absurd. As a scientist, I find that hard to accept. There must be an unchanging rational ground in which the logical, orderly nature of the universe is rooted. So when you're looking at the first major tenet of old atheism, new atheism really hasn't changed in spite of scientific discovery. And theists kind of look at all this and say, well, guys, you know, the scientific discovery actually does support the idea of an intelligent non-physical cause. It doesn't diminish it. And there's a lot of scientists who actually agree with it. Let's go to the second topic now. This is the second big claim. The second big claim was basically that science is the modern way of knowing. Okay, now old atheists basically said, and this is according to Robert Ingersoll, is there any other knowledge than scientific knowledge? You know, Buchner, Haeckel, Ingersoll, and a variety of the others basically were saying that science is the only way of truly knowing something, because science is based upon fact. It's reliable. And they believe that science could illumine any subject. And they also believe that religion, because it involves faith, is faulty, because they saw faith as being without evidence, not with evidence. And so then, therefore, their conclusion was, and this is according to Ludwig Buchner, science must replace religion. Now, the new atheists actually say very, very similar things. There's a slightly modified claim in that now they don't say that science is the only way of knowing, they say science is the best way of knowing. And they do acknowledge that science is silent on some things. So, for example, science has nothing to say about how it came into being. Science can't answer any whys. Why does nature exist? Why does it exist the way it does? Why do people exist? You know, why anything? Science can't answer any of the whys. Science also is silent on value, morality, and ethics. And it's silent on meaning and purpose. And then the other observation that they have is, well, yeah, we agree science is self-limiting, because science limits itself to the physical, okay? So there's a lot of things that science doesn't opine on. But yet Victor Stenger says, atheists view science as the best means humanity has yet come up with for understanding the world. Now, theists say a few things in response to that, which you'll see on the next. Theists generally say, yeah, we love science. Science is great. It's a great way of knowing things. Nothing wrong with science. But science is silent on a lot of things. You know, all the whys, you know, the value, morality, ethics, meaning, purpose, and beauty. All these things exist, but science has nothing to say about them. Okay, science is definitely self-limiting, but there's also other great ways of knowing things. History, archaeology, experience, and people who believe in God add another one, revelation, because they believe that God does reveal himself. Now, theists don't say that science is flawed. They just say that science is limited. Okay, so here you have basically modern, or not modern, but new atheists repeating almost exactly the same thing that old atheism was saying. So in this case, nothing was new. Let's go to the next one. Now they're saying that religion is outdated. So they had a lot of arguments back in the late 1800s on this subject. They claimed that religion was rooted in superstition, that all the scriptures are flawed, miracles don't happen, you know, religious institutions are autocratic, and they basically suppress progress and the advancement of knowledge. You know, of course, religion causes war. You know, it requires belief without evidence. It opposes, you know, intellectual progress. And again, science must replace it. And it's kind of interesting. Ernst Haeckel used to say that, you know, of all the wars which nations have waged against each other with fire and sword, religious wars have been the bloodiest. You know, Buchner says science must replace religion. Ingersoll said, and I thought this is interesting, you know, if Jesus claimed to have wrought miracles, he must have been either dishonest or insane. So obviously his belief was miracles don't happen. And their belief was miracles don't happen. Why? Because in a physical world, miracles don't happen. So it's totally circular reasoning. And again, the whole idea of religion starting in primitive superstition. As you would expect, when you look at new atheism on the next page, it's basically the same thing. The only difference is that people like Richard Dawkins have added a new idea, because if everything was evolved and everything was generated by nature, then didn't religion evolve? Yeah. And if nature is the source of everything, then didn't natural selection select for religion? And Richard Dawkins claims that natural selection is a one-way ticket to complexity, and that natural selection basically never fails. It always comes up with something that's beneficial, except in the area of religion, where he thinks that nature erred and caused it. And you have other people basically stating that, evolution messed up in this one category. They also throw in the idea of religion taking away your freedom, and that it makes good people do bad things. So a couple of the key people here, David Silverman, who again was the head of American Atheists in New Jersey. He says, religion makes good people do bad things while thinking they're doing good, effectively turning good people into bad people, or at least sometimes. Religion deserves to die. And then Sam Harris, again, parrots the comment, a glance at history or at the page of any newspaper reveals that the ideas which divide one group of human beings from another only to unite them in slaughter generally have their roots in religion. So again, the ideas really aren't new. Theists don't have a lot of difficulty in responding to this. They basically respond, belief in God actually is rational. Nobody is asking anybody to believe anything, that is not rooted in evidence, reason, and revelation. Belief is not opposed to progress, that most of the great scientists in history have believed in God. And certainly all religion is not the same. And then obviously, if nature did select for religion, which I don't believe to be the case, then wouldn't that make religion beneficial? So, Mr. Dawkins, your logic really makes no sense. And then Christian scriptures actually do withstand scrutiny, and they have for decades and decades. Yes, sadly, some institutions are autocratic. That's the case. You can look at human institutions and find problems with almost anything, whether it's political, or anything. And the other comment is that religion actually, when you look at the history of it, it actually seldom causes war. And this is from Nigel Barber, who's an atheist. He's a psychologist. He says, religion is rarely the intrinsic cause of conflict, and explicitly religious wars such as the medieval crusades are rare. And just out of curiosity, I looked a lot of this one up myself, and I looked at the history of the United States wars, and it was, we've been in roughly 14 wars. Only one of them had anything to do with religion. That was the War on Terror. And when you look at the total deaths, war deaths in the United States, it came to something like 0.7% of all war deaths in the United States that had anything to do with religion. And that's kind of interesting because about 90% of the people in America believe in God. And then when you look at day-to-day crime in America, it's not even 1% of crime that has anything to do with a religious bias in America out of millions of crimes. So on a day-to-day basis, and in terms of war, and when you even look at the history of war, there was an encyclopedia put together called The History of War, and an analysis of the data basically revealed that throughout recorded history, only 7% of wars had anything at all to do with religion, and only 4% of war deaths. So a lot of these claims that are parroted over and over and over again have stuck in spite of the fact that there's absolutely no historical basis and they're totally non-historical claims. The history shows exactly the opposite. So again, new atheism looks a lot like old atheism. There's really nothing new here. So we'll go through a few more of these. Next thing, and this is, you hear a lot today, they say that God isn't needed for morality. And the old atheists claimed that people can be moral without God. Ludwig Buchner claimed that morals and moral ideas basically came from society. And Gustav Spiller, who's an interesting guy because he was very big into the ethical society movement. And at one time, he was a part of a group that had, I guess, originally started off as the Ethical Church in England. So they basically worshiped moral attributes, but did not worship God. So they were atheists who basically held up moral attributes as their objects of veneration. And so anyway, he thought that, the whole idea of morality coming from God was, that was okay back in the day, but in our current stage of moral development, that's just totally inappropriate. So new atheist claims are actually pretty similar. So here you have new atheism again saying people can be moral without God. Richard Dawkins characterizes it as a group zeitgeist. Basically, it's kind of like a group perception of morality that changes over time. And then you have David Silverman, who basically says, morality is individual, and I certainly don't want to push morality on anyone, which is a bit ironic because in his book, Fighting God, he views it as a moral imperative for him to oppose the existence of God and morality imposed by any form of religion. So, he says that he shouldn't impose his moral beliefs on anybody, but then he seeks to impose his moral beliefs on people. So again, there's really not much difference here. Okay, theists traditionally have had not a lot of difficulty responding to this. And the last talk that I did, I kind of highlighted, people who don't believe in God can do moral things. Everybody is morally aware. Okay. But for us to have the kind of morality that we want, it actually does require a God. If you want personhood not based upon your physical capabilities, if you want value that's high, equal, universal, and unchanging, if you want moral principles that are beneficial, universal, non-conflicting, and law-like, and if you want this to be applied to everybody the same all over the world, that ultimately requires an independent, non-changing, universal valuer, and that requires a God. So, again, theists don't have a great deal of difficulty in responding to new atheism's claims because they really haven't changed from old atheism. Got a few more. Belief without evidence is wrong. Okay, so you see what's happening here? They say that religion is based upon faith. Science is based upon evidence. Belief without evidence is wrong. So now this comes from William Clifford's essay, lectures and essays. He did an essay basically on the ethics of belief. And he said, basically, to sum up, it is wrong always and anywhere to believe anything on the basis of insufficient evidence. Now, they originally got this idea from Descartes, okay? And it's kind of ironic because Descartes was a believer in God and a Christian. So it's kind of ironic that they try to get this idea from him. But it's been repeated throughout history. So you have Clifford saying it, you had Bertrand Russell saying it, you had Carl Sagan saying it in his books, you have Victor Stenger saying it, you have Richard Dawkins saying it. So it's basically for generations, people have been saying exactly the same thing, but now it's intensified. So instead of saying it's unethical to believe without evidence, they basically say that faith is always evil because it ignores evidence. So you see what they're doing? They're vilifying faith. They're vilifying faith. And Dawkins says faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument, which isn't true. So his definition of what faith is is basically some sort of authoritarian dogmatism, but that's not what faith is. That's not what faith is in the Christian faith, Jewish faith, and it's certainly not, what in America we would have defined as faith for probably the last 400 years. Okay, theists have an easy response to this one. And the theists say that, gee, guys, you're assuming that the only kind of faith is religious faith, but that's not really true, because science is also faith-based. So when you go back and read people like Max Planck and some of these other guys, you basically see them saying that they have faith in the ability for science to illumine, faith in the ability of science to discover, faith in the scientific method. Okay, so it's like, so science is also faith-based, and new atheists kind of forget that. Faith is a belief. Okay, faith actually consists of multiple things. It starts with belief, then it goes to trust, and then it turns into reliance. Okay, theists also say that, gee, guys, you're assuming that people who believe in God do so without evidence. And that's not true, because lots of smart people believe in God because of evidence. And then theists also say that, gee, guys, you're assuming that religion requires blind belief, and it doesn't. The New Testament actually presents evidence and invites a response. And I find it interesting because even when you look at Jesus spent so much time demonstrating who he was rather than proclaiming who he was. And then when one of his disciples would say, oh, you're the Christ, the Son of God, he said, hey, chill out, don't tell anybody yet. And then he goes out and heals people and does all this stuff. So according to the Christian faith, the New Testament presents evidence for belief and invites a response. It's not, out there stating believe, believe, believe blindly. That's just simply not what it is. And I find it interesting. Go to the next page. Edward Fesser is a philosophy professor here in the United States. He was an atheist. And he came to belief in God initially by reading atheist philosophers. Okay, he would read Thomas Nagel and a variety of others. And then he started going back and reading Aristotle. And then he started reading Aquinas. And what he realized was that the philosophical case for God is not only compelling, but it is intellectually mind-blowing. It is that rich. So here you have people like Edward Fesser, who's a philosophy professor who came to belief in God, in spite of his former atheism. Antony Flew was an atheist philosopher for 50 years, proclaiming that God did not exist, and changed his mind. Alan Sandage, one of the greatest astronomers in the world, probably second only to Edwin Hubble in terms of his impact in the last century, became a believer in God when he was 50 years old because of science. Francis Collins, who was former head of the National Institutes of Health, I think he still is. I think he just announced his retirement. PhD in chemistry, MD. He came to believe in God because of science, moral law, and a variety of other factors. But it was principally because of the combination of evidence of scientific belief. Alistair McGrath, very interesting guy. Okay, Irish guy goes to Oxford. He's working toward his PhD in molecular biophysics. Was an atheist because, all intelligent people certainly are atheists, until he started studying and then and realized that, excuse me, science doesn't answer any of the really deep questions in life, meaning, purpose, morality, anything. And it started him on a quest, and he concluded that God exists. Ian Hutchinson, professor at MIT, head of the nuclear fusion project, plasma physicist, came to believe in God while he was working toward his PhD. Michael Guillen, he was the former science editor at ABC. And if you haven't, I'm going to pitch his book. If you haven't read his book, I just got it. I really like it. So you might want to pick it up. It's called Believing is Seeing. It just came out. It's a nice little read. It's really good. Hugh Ross, astronomer, former atheist. Sarah Salviander, astrophysicist, professor at University of Texas, Austin, was a former atheist who came to belief because of scientific evidence. And then the last two I think are really interesting. William Murray was Madalyn Murray O'Hair's son. Okay, he was the guy that the lawsuit was filed over to remove prayer from public school. And in spite of his atheism, later in life came to believe that God exists. And Peter Hitchens, who's Christopher Hitchens' brother, who believed all the same things, right? Atheist, Marxist, Trotskyist, changed his mind. These are not unintelligent people. And I think it's interesting that when you look at Nobel Prize laureates of the last century, 90% believed in God. So anyway, the point of this is, you know, the idea of belief without evidence being wrong is pretty ludicrous. And so for new atheists to hold on to this is, to me, just pretty astonishing. The next idea, and there's only two left, is pain and suffering disproves God. This was really, really big, especially during the 1900s. Annie Besant, you know, this was one of the biggest reasons why she did not believe in God, the pain and suffering in the world. But when you read what she says, it's really pretty strange. She says, "My heart revolts against the specter of an almighty indifference to the pain of sentient beings. My conscience rebels against the injustice, the cruelty, the inequality which surrounds me on every side. But I believe in man." Well, who caused all that pain and suffering? Man. So it's just ironic to me that she blamed the pain and suffering in the world on God, instead of looking around and seeing who is really causing it. And new atheists basically do the same thing. I think the only difference is old atheists would appeal to Epicurus's paradox. You know, how would if God is all powerful and all good, you know, does he want to stop pain and suffering, but he's not able? Or is he able, but he doesn't want to? Now, that was the classic argument, you know, quoted by David Hume. Okay. Now, what the new atheists do is, instead of coming up with a two attribute God, you know, one attribute being metaphysical, all powerful, and one being moral, loving, they come up with a three attribute God, all knowing, all powerful, and all good. And they say, in the language of science, the empirical fact of a necessary suffering in the world is inconsistent with a God who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. So it's basically the same argument. They just add one more attribute. Okay. The irony is Epicurus was not an atheist. Epicurus actually believed in God. And when you look at his letter to Menoetius, he actually encouraged Menoetius to worship the gods and venerate the gods. He actually believed in many gods. And then I think the irony also is, when you look at the next page, even Christians agree that a two or three attribute God does not exist. So it's like they come up with this convoluted idea of God and then go, that God doesn't exist. Well, Christians would agree. That God is not a two-attribute God. God has metaphysical attributes like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present. God has personal attributes. God is creative. God is wise. God is moral. There's God is relational. All these personal attributes. And then when you look at God's moral attributes, God is faithful. God is truthful. God is good. God is just. God is loving. God has multiple attributes. So the kind of God that they're contending does not exist, we would say, you're right. We don't believe in a God like that either. But that's not God. Okay. Theists also respond and say, but you know what? We agree that there is pain and suffering in the world. There's issues, there's problems. But a good God could actually have a good reason for allowing pain. Okay. And the first one is that love requires choice. Now, when you look at Annie Besant's comments, Annie Besant, all the bad things that she observed in the world were actually caused by people. So why would a good God allow people to do so much damage? Why would a good God allow people to be so selfish, to be so violent, to be so cruel? Okay. God could have pre-programmed us all to only do good. But guess what? Then there's no longer really love in the world. All you have is a programmed response. Love is only love if it's a choice. And then the last point that theists generally make is that human-induced pain isn't God's fault. So the whole idea of pain and suffering disproving God, the argument's been around a really long time. It wasn't compelling 150 years ago, and it's still not compelling now. So there's really no difference between new and old atheism in this regard. And then the last one that I'm going to cover is basically historic proofs for God fail. And, Annie Besant, had this observation. Richard Dawkins, called, Thomas Aquinas's proofs vacuous. But it's just, the whole idea of calling Aquinas's comments vacuous when, he was one of the, most incredible thinkers, of an entire century, is pretty interesting. And Edward Fesser really takes him to task on it. And he takes him to task by basically saying, excuse me, you may have read the summary of Aquinas's 5 ways, but you didn't read Aquinas, because your characterization of Aquinas is so simplistic that you obviously didn't read him. And that's another book that, if you ever have time, if you're into philosophy, Edward Fesser, The Last Superstition. This is kind of a philosophical perspective on the existence of God from a former atheist, heavily focused on historical proofs. He's a big fan of Aquinas. Okay. But again, old atheists said that Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways failed. New atheists, again, are saying that Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways fail. But you kind of go, did any of them actually read Thomas Aquinas? And Edward Fesser doesn't think so. Aquinas is interesting in terms of, actually go to the next page if you would. Because theists generally today would pretty much agree that he seems to be on track. And he had the whole idea of an unmoved mover, a first efficient cause, a non-contingent being, an uttermost source of perfection, and natural things being designed, okay, appearing designed. And his perspective is, whether there was a beginning or not, the way that things look today, the way that things operate, the way that things function, appear to have an efficient, intelligent cause. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying what he's saying. But again, theists would basically say today that science actually does suggest intelligent causation. And so basically theists are saying, guys, we've learned a lot from science, and science really does suggest an intelligent cause. And guys, all of the natural explanations pretty much fail because they can't provide any whys. And the natural explanations basically provide us with no physical cause. We don't know what caused life. We don't know what caused all of these things. We don't know why the universe came into being. And the only, answer that the current new atheist can come up with is basically, we don't know either, but it had to have been a natural cause, and aren't we lucky? So it's again based upon materialism, reductionism, with a whole lot of chance. The challenge that theists have with this kind of perspective is, and this is what people like Stephen Meyer and Michael Behe have talked about for years, is that all of these ideas actually exceed the probabilities available in the universe, and they exceed the time available. And I don't know if you've read any Thomas Nagel. He's a NYU professor, very smart guy. I actually really enjoy reading his stuff. He's an atheist. Okay, he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, and basically in it he's saying, look, natural selection could not have done this in the time available. It just couldn't have done. There's something else going on. And so he's theorizing that the notion of consciousness or mind, is it inherent in the universe? Because natural selection of itself could not have done this. Roger Penrose, Nobel Prize winner, physicist, says the same thing. He goes, I'm a fan of natural selection, but natural selection alone could not have done this. So Roger Penrose is actually advocating the possibility of a new branch of physics called mind, because the universe displays intellect and purpose, and we don't know why scientifically. But theists look at that and say, guys, this is what we've been saying all along. Thomas Aquinas kind of got it right. Okay, so let's cut to the chase. What is new about new atheism? Well, not much. And this is according to Alex Rosenberg, who is an atheist. He's a philosophy professor at Duke. So Rosenberg basically says the relative lack of originality in the arguments of the recent bestsellers attacking religion, The God Delusion, God is Not Great, Letter to Christian Nation, shows that the arguments have been around for quite some time and have achieved little effect. So even to another atheist, new atheism isn't really new. Okay. So why do they call it new? Let's go to the next page. It's kind of a new approach. And this is according to Victor Stenger, who's a big fan of new atheism. He wrote the book, The New Atheism. He says, perhaps the most unique position of new atheism is that faith, which is belief without supporting evidence, should not be given the respect, even deference, it obtains in modern society. Faith is always foolish and leads to the many evils of society. And he goes on to say that the new atheists are authors who preach a more militant, in-your-face kind of atheism. And I think he's right, because when I read The God Delusion, I see Richard Dawkins just condescension, condescension, condescension. So the condescension approach of Dawkins, the anger of Hitchens and David Silverman. Silverman's book is I'm trying to remember the name of it, Fighting God. And the mocking, P.Z. Myers, his approach, he's much kinder than Dawkins, Hitchens, or Silverman, but he still uses the approach of making fun of people who believe in God. That's his tool. So anyway, it's this aggression and disrespect is one of the things that's new. And they actually make a couple of new claims, which is surprising. You would think that they would make like 20 or 30, but there's really only a couple. The first claim is from Stenger, who says that science has disproven God. And he goes, I argue that the Judeo-Christian Islamic God can be proved not to exist beyond a reasonable doubt. And then Sam Harris, comes up with the idea that mysticism is rational, but religion is not. I thought, wow, these are really interesting ideas. So let's take a look at the first one really quick. So where does Stenger come from that science disproved God? And these were his ideas. He basically said a workable model disproves God. And he cites the multiverse idea. And he cites Stephen Hawking. Okay, only problem is this. It's not actually a workable model. It's an unprovable theory. It's an unprovable hypothesis. So what he's actually saying is an unprovable hypothesis disproves God. When, excuse me, for forever, people have been saying that it's impossible for science to disprove God. You know, Max Planck, you know, Nobel Prize winning physicist, you know, they named Planck's constant after him, said religion belongs to that realm that is inviolable before the law of causation and therefore closed to science. He basically is saying that the laws of, or the tools of science can't prove or disprove God. And Richard Feynman, again, Nobel Prize winning physicist, he goes, I agree that science cannot disprove God. I absolutely agree. I also agree that belief in science and religion is consistent. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then what I really found was interesting is even Richard Dawkins doesn't agree with this. Okay. He says God, while not technically disprovable, is very, very improbable indeed. So even Dawkins doesn't believe that you can disprove God. The second one is pretty strange too. He says there are no gaps, right? And I'm going, excuse me, you know, you used to criticize Christians and believers in God for the God of the gap approach, but now you're using it yourself. And the reality is there actually really are a massive number of gaps. You know, the first are the three big gaps in causation. You know, what caused the universe to happen to begin with? We have no idea. The second is what caused life to happen? We have no idea. You know, the third is what caused consciousness? We have no idea. Absolutely no idea. Massive gaps. Okay. But then even when you look at biology, and I like Fazil Rana's book, and I think you've had him speak a couple of times, The Cell's Design, because Fazil Rana points out all of these kind of chicken and the egg scenarios. And like one that's pretty interesting is, you know, for a single cell to exist, it has to have 5 processes simultaneously. Okay, so it has to have the ability to produce a cell wall. It has to have the ability to take in energy. It has to have the ability to synthesize proteins. It has to have the ability to, for DNA to replicate, and it has to have the ability for the cell to replicate. 5 things that have to happen, that have to exist simultaneously for one cell to exist. We don't know how that happened. That's a pretty big gap, right? So for him to say there's no gaps is kind of ludicrous. But Fazil Rana's point was not so much that gaps prove the existence of God. What he's saying is that all of these relationships are massive evidence that God designed it, that there was an intelligent cause behind this, because there's no natural way that this could have happened by itself. How could 5 processes come about simultaneously without being coordinated? The improbability is just, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible for cold, dead, unthinking matter to do that. Okay. And then the last comment is, gee, guys, you know, you say that there's no empirical evidence for God. Okay. But there actually is, but you just don't even want to look at it. So here's an example. And let's see if I can find this. Actually, this is kind of an odd example, but I think it's actually pretty powerful. You ever heard of near-death experiences? And near-death experiences aren't, I almost got hit by a car, right? Boy, that was a close call. Near-death experiences are where you actually died. Okay, you were dead. It isn't you almost died. You were dead. Okay, so the University of Southampton in England in 2014 did a study of 2,060 people who died from cardiac arrest. They were dead. They didn't almost die. They were dead. Okay, 330 of them were resuscitated, which is pretty cool. 140 of these people participated in the survey or in the study. 39% of them said that they were aware while they were dead, while the doctors were resuscitating them. 13% said that they experienced they had out-of-body experiences. Then here in the United States, University of Virginia, okay, which is the Center for Perceptual Studies. They've done similar kind of analysis. Their conclusions are that of the people who died, 42% encountered other people while they were dead, some of whom they knew, some of whom they did not. Okay, now that's sort of empirical, don't you think? So to say that there's no empirical evidence means you weren't even looking. Yeah, and then you have the Pew Research Foundation, who basically has done surveys of people who attend church, Christians who attend to church once a month. Okay, 80% of them claim that they experience the presence of God during the worship service. And that's kind of empirical, right? But again, it's like they kind of choose to define what's empirical and what's not, okay? But even things which are quantifiably empirical are significant. But the Christian's real response, the theist's real response is, excuse me, you know, everywhere I look, I see structure, I see the signs of intellect, I see the signs of purpose. So in any case, Stanger's view doesn't really hold up even with other atheists like Richard Dawkins. Okay, let's look at what Sam Harris had to say. This one's kind of interesting. Okay, Sam Harris says mysticism is rational, but religion is not. And this is kind of a strange claim. Again, he's saying that mysticism is empirical. But he cites in his book, The End of Faith, 5 mystics that he basically speaks very, very highly of. You know, that these guys are on the right track. So I just picked 2 of them at random. I picked Shankara and Padmasambhava. So Shankara was 8th century, 8th or 9th century Hindu. And it's interesting because, you know, this is Vesnas George, who kind of wrote a book on the subject. He says, Shankara did recognize the important role worship and devotion play in the early stages of an aspirant's way to self-realization. He wrote many hymns in praise of the popular deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and the Divine Mother to help ordinary people move towards their ultimate realization. I'm going, okay, excuse me, Sam, you say that mysticism is rational and it's not like religion, but excuse me, Shankara, they had gods, goddesses, hymns, praise. Kind of sounds like religion to me. And then I look at Padmasambhava, who is Buddhist. Okay, he supposedly emanated as an 8-year-old on a lotus flower in a lake near Pakistan. Okay, they claim that he's self-existent, totally enlightened being, a Buddha. He supposedly lived for 3,650 years on earth, but he's immortal. He supposedly converted evil gods in Tibet to Buddhism, performed miracles, and he and Shankara were both into kind of the idea of ultimate reality, okay? And I'm going, wait a minute. You know, I read all these things written by the followers of these groups, and they say that their experience is subjective. So I'm going, Sam, how do you call that empirical? Okay. And then he says it's not like religion, but actually it is. You know, you got gods, goddesses, you got miracles, you got self-existent beings. It's like, dude, you know, I don't know what you're calling religion, but these guys are teaching religion. It's kind of strange stuff, but they're teaching religion. And then he says it's consistent with atheism. I'm going, Sam, this is essentially naturalistic pantheism. What Sam Harris seems to be wanting is he likes the idea of ultimate reality, okay, apart from God. So he likes the idea, it seems, of eternal existence apart from God. The way I would characterize that, if you just told me what these guys believe, is they're looking for eternal life. They just don't want a personal God. They want to be part of God. So to bring all this to a conclusion, I look at new atheism and I look at old atheism and I say, they're really not particularly different. The core foundation is materialism and reductionism, has been for 150 years. You know, the second key thing is, you know, it actually employs a less than genial approach. It's pretty mean. A lot of these guys are mean, with the exception of Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is not mean. And I'm actually kind of curious as to why they include him in their group as a new atheist, because he's not mean. And then, you know, it's the few new claims that it actually makes don't even seem to be shared by other new atheists. You know, and I go look at it and I go, well, guys, you know, after 150 years, we've learned a lot. You know, we have old atheism, we have new atheism, but theists still don't really seem to have a huge amount of difficulty in responding to either of them. And I think that's interesting. So that's the 50,000-foot view of new atheism and old atheism, and how little it's actually changed in 150 years.